The goal of this entire course is to create backend application using Node. So it is very important you have basic understanding of how web actually works behind the scene. And until now, we have clear understanding. We are having two kind of programming languages, one which are used in front end and second which are used in back end. So using Node, what we are doing, same programming language JavaScript, we will be using both in front end and back end application. But now let me ask you a simple question. What happens whenever you are typing some URL in your browser? If you want to request some new page or if you want to some request from API data, behind the scene, how you are getting this data? So mostly the simple answer would be we have our browser which is the client using which we are sending request to the server where that web page which we are requesting that is hosted, and once the web server receives the request, in return server is going to send back the response which will be containing the web page which we have requested. And this entire process is called as request response model, or you can also call it as client server architecture. But if you really want to go deep and understand how this request and responses will be working on the web, then in this lecture you will be getting complete high level overview of this model. Let's say I am using Chrome browser, which is nothing but my client. So here inside this, I just want to access swiggy.com/instamart. So what I will do, I will be typing this URL in my browser. And in this URL, we are having this protocol. It can either be HTTP or HTTPS. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol and HTTPS stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. And main difference between this protocol is HTTPS will be encrypted, which will be using TLS or SSL certificate. So whatever logic we will be using behind HTTP request, same logic will be applied for HTTPS. So in this URL, first we are going to have the protocol. Second, we will be having the domain name. And finally, third, we are going to have this resource. And from this URL, what I am trying to access? I am trying to access this resource Instamart. And this domain name Swiggy is not the real address of the server which we are trying to access. So basically, domain name is the name which can be easily recognized by the human. So Swiggy can be easily recognized, and whenever we are searching for Swiggy, we can easily type that domain. Instead of remembering all the IP addresses, we are having this domain name. But whenever we are trying to access this domain name, we can't access using domain. Instead, what we have to do, this domain name has to be converted to real IP address. And that happens using DNS server. DNS stands for domain name server, and these are special kind of server. So basically they are like phone book of the internet. In your mobile also you will be saving the number, along with number you will be giving the name. Why you are giving name? Because it is easy to remember the name instead of remembering the number. So similarly, it is easy to remember the domain name instead of remembering the IP address. So DNS is a special kind of server, and basically it is like phone book of the internet. And what happens once we make the request in a browser, DNS server will be looking up in its database and it will try to find the exact IP of the website which we are trying to access. And after that, DNS server is going to match the web address of the URL to the real IP address of the server. And this process will be done by your internet service provider. You don't have to go in detail, but this is how DNS server is going to match web address of the URL to the real IP address of the server. And once the IP address is found, that IP address will be sent back to the client. And this is how real address will be looking like. Again, here we are going to have the protocol. Now, instead of domain name, we are going to have real IP address of that domain. And finally, we are going to have this port number. And this port number is nothing to do with /instamart, which we have accessed in a browser, because that resource will be sent using HTTP request that we are going to see in few minutes. Once we have real IP address, then this TCP IP socket connection will be established between browser and server. So once this connection is established, both client and server will be connected, and this connection will be kept alive for the entire time that it takes to transfer all the files from the web server to the client which they have requested. So both these protocols are internet's fundamental control system, because these are the ones who will be setting the rules about how the data has to be moved on the internet. Then once this connection is established, then third, what we will do, finally, we are going to make our HTTP request. Again, HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And this HTTP is also a communication protocol which is having set of rules using which we can allow our client and web servers to communicate. And how that is going to work? By sending request and response messages from client to server back. Now, our request message will be looking something like this. Here inside this first line, we are going to have HTTP method, and this is where our request target, our resources will be sent, that is /instamart, and then we are going to have this HTTP version. And talking about HTTP method, we are having multiple methods. We have get method, we have post method, we have put method, delete method, patch method. Based on the different requirement, we are having different HTTP method. So this is where we are going to send our resource /instamart. And here using HTTP request, we are sending this /instamart. So our server will be figuring out what client is trying to access. Now here, if this was empty, if we were not having anything, then server will understand client is trying to access the root home page. Then here we are having this HTTP request headers, and then finally we are having this request body. And inside this HTTP request headers, we will have information about request itself. We have multiple headers like what time client is requesting, what is the language, what is the host. So we can have tons and tons of headers. And then finally, we are going to have request body. For example, if you're sending some data to the server, then inside the request body, we can just have the data which will be sent to the server. Now, once the request is received to the server, behind the scene, server will be working on that request, and it will be giving the web page once it is ready. So what we are going to get? We are going to get response back from the server. And this is how response will be looking like. Again here in first line, we are going to have HTTP version, but instead of resource, target or method, we are going to have status code and message. Status code 200 means everything is fine, and message is okay. If you're having any error, if the page is not found multiple times, maybe you have seen, you will have 404 page not found. If you're having some 500 or something errors, that means there is some issue in the server. Then again, we are going to have HTTP request headers, and then finally, we are having this request body. And usually inside this request body, we will be having JSON data which is coming from the API, or we can also have the HTML web page that we have requested. And make a note, These HTTP request headers are not written by the developers, but still you should be having understanding what are sent and what are received inside these headers. But it is not the end. For simple web page, this is fine. But here, if you are accessing the web page, then there will be more requests and responses. And that's because when we do the first request, we will only get the initial HTML file. And then that HTML file will be scanned by the browser for all the assets that it needs. Because inside HTML, we will have images, we will have the links which are linked to the JavaScript, we will have CSS, we will have lot of other things. So our browser will be scanning for all the assets which are required to build our entire web page. And then for each and every different file, there will be new HTTP request header made to the server. Okay, once first request is sent, only HTML will be sent, but for each and every file, different request will be sent to the server. So basically, this entire request and response will be happening for every single file which is included in our web page. Definitely, if the web page is large and if you are having larger files, one by one, we cannot be sending the request and responses. So, there can be multiple requests and responses happening at the same time. But still, the amount is very limited because if we do multiple requests and responses, then this connection will be slowed down and we are going to get the response very slow. So once all the files are arrived, then the web page can be rendered inside the browser according to our HTML, CSS and JavaScript which we have written in our application. Now let us see how this request and response data is actually sent across the web. And this is defined by our TCP/IP communication protocol which will tell exactly how the data has to be traveled across the web. So first, what TCP will be doing, it is just going to break the request and responses down into thousands of small chunks, and those chunks are called as packets before they are sent. And once all these small packets receive the destination, TCP is going to reassemble all the packets into their original request or response. And this is very important to reassemble because each and every packet will be taking different route across the internet, because using this way we can get our message fast, which is definitely not possible if we are sending big chunk of data over internet. When TCP reassemble all the packet, what IP protocol will be doing, it is actually going to send and route these different packets through our internet. So using this, it ensures they arrive at the destination they should go using the IP addresses on each packets. Behind the scene, this is how client server architecture will be working. Just take your time and understand, because whatever processing will be happening inside the web server, in this case, we will be using Node.js.